This meeting is being
So
recorded.
you were kind of talking about, and I really wanted to talk to you ever since kind of the whole stuff with Elon popped up. So because you mentioned and I always thought it was interesting because he's from South Africa, and then you messaged me about the whole South Africa thing, and it made me kind of think like, okay, like what groups are in like would you say like what groups are kind of prominent in the administration and kind of within that like right wing circle right now?
I mean, at the top levels, you've got the kind of
Like, is it
stereotype.
really like, hey, this is this group and there's this group and there's this group, or is it kind of like a blend?
I would say it's more kind of like depends on where you're at in terms of like station. So like at the top level, they're pretty much what they appear to be. I mean, you got your Trump, you got your Musk, you got all that. But when it comes to like people like they're doing like the staffing, like the actual like foot soldiers, as it were. I mean, a lot of those guys, they're Zoomers. I mean, you've seen how like all the Doge guys are like 19 and 20 and stuff like that. A lot of them, I mean, like they're I don't want to say groypers, but they're more. I would
What
say
is
the
a
online.
groiper?
So that's kind of like that. I don't want to say it because I feel like that's a very specific connotation, but like there is different groups in like the right, especially at like the grassroots level. So I mean, like you've got kind of a hodgepodge. Basically, I would put it like this: like if you sit like right wing Twitter, like that would kind of give you an idea of what like the staff kind of looks like. A lot of those young guys, they're pretty right wing. They're online. They're the kind that have like the anonymous account on Twitter, that kind of stuff.
That's
Uh,
that's like the techno right? Isn't that what they're kind of called?
mm, Techno right in the way you're probably thinking of is to people like Musk or like Peter Thiel and all them. They're their own thing. That I would
So this is
that
like
is the
this is like online right then.
yeah. So this would be like people like me and you,
Okay, interesting.
like having a troll account on Twitter or something like that. So
Yeah.
and there's a lot of factionalization within that. You've got I know I'm gonna sound like really stupid trying to explain all this, but like okay, so like I'm
No,
trying
I
to
mean
think of
I
people.
think this is super interesting because it's like I mean I gave you credit this in the past episodes, and I think you're 100% right. You're like, you're like Stephen Miller is going to come into this administration and is going to do some fucking damage. And like nobody, and I remember people were like, no, who's this guy, blah blah blah, and like when you said that, then looking now, like him and Russell Vought, I'm like those two guys, like they are like they're deep in this, and they're
Mhm.
very effective, and I'm like no one. I mean, I think was it Stephen Miller? I think was in the previous Trump administration, but
Yeah.
I'm like for the most part, these guys were very much under the radar. And you kind of had these factions, even for a long time, like kind of really kind of playing out. And now they're just in the front page of the news. You know what I mean?
Mhm. So, well, I give an anecdote about Stephen Miller, which I always think is fascinating. So he's Jewish,
Yeah,
but his
he
his
looks
college roommate.
Jewish.
You better be careful.
I mean, he does.
But his college roommate was God, what's his name? I had it in my head now. I forgot it. Oh God, let me
When
look that up.
oh, it wasn't JD or anything like that,
No,
right? It
no, no. It
was
wasn't JD. It was what is his name? Oh God, let me look that up real fast. That sounds stupid now because it was like a really cool thing to.
well. So speaking of roommates with JD, my
Mhm.
state senator in Georgia was JD
I,
Vance's
s-
uh, roommate in undergrad.
I know I know who you're talking about because wasn't he like tweeting about him a while back?
Yeah, I think it was undergrad. It was he was his roommate, and it might have been like one of the first few years of law school or something like that. I don't specifically remember, but I remember, yeah, like he's kind of like a thing, which he always thought was
Okay,
interesting.
so his roommate in college, I just not figured it out. Richard Spencer of Unite the Right fame, so that big
Oh, that's what it
so they
was.
were so they were roommates, and it's kind of funny because I mean, like I said, Stephen Miller's Jewish, so it's kind of funny in that. And then what actually got Stephen Miller really famous? Do you remember the Duke lacrosse thing from like 2007, where like the whole like lacrosse team at like Duke got accused of like raping like a stripper?
Oh, I know what you're talking about, and I remember
Stephen
hearing about it.
Stephen
But
Miller was at the time. I think he was like the head of the campus paper, and he was like one of the few people on campus and like at all to like publicly defend them. Which,
Well,
for the
then they
record,
came back and like they didn't get in trouble, did they?
the woman that accused them came out last year and admitted she made it all up. So,
Yeah.
but I just thought that was interesting because that's kind of how some of his connections are kind of interesting, and then you kind of figure out his backstory, how he rose to power is kind of
Yeah.
interesting in of itself. But so God, we would have to get like to explain like the staffers, which I
Like we
really
need
don't
like a
think
graph. Like we need like something to be like,
you,
hey, like
you
here's the
really
different
do
groups.
because there is a lot of like the online. You're calling the tech right when I think tech right, I think of Silicon Valley, I think of
Yeah,
Elon, I think of Peter
you're right.
Thiel.
You're
But
right.
now when I'm saying so, that's the tech right. Now when I'm talking about the online right, that's like your average everyday person. Like I said, like the best way you could think about it is if you're ever on Twitter and you see like interact with like anonymous accounts that are like right wing. It's kind of
Hmm.
what I'm talking about. That kind of phenomena. Big one, and this is going to sound absolutely stupid, like saying it out loud without like the cultural cachet to know about. It's like there's something called the Bappists, which stands for. So there was this guy who wrote this book called Bronze Age Pervert, and it
Oh,
sounds
I've heard
it's
about
yeah.
this too. I've
So
I've heard
so
about
that
him.
that's one. They call themselves the Baptists, and then there's hold on one second.
But that's like the guys who are like the Baptists or whatever. Those are like the guys who um it's almost like those are like your paleo conservative kind of guys, right?
What now?
The Baptists or whatever, aren't those like your paleo conservative people or they're
Nah,
like
I would say there's influences there, but they're definitely they're really out there, shall we say? So I mean, they're kind of their own thing.
so like
And
give me an
then
example of like kind of some of the things that they are very into that isn't kind of there with other groups. Like
there's definitely like
what's a key feature of them?
I would say there's definitely like there's an obsession with the past to the extent they kind of see themselves as like barbarians. Like there's
Mm,
definitely like a sort of fascination with like I mean it's kind of in the name. I mean kind of reliving that. It's a very unique ideology, and I honestly don't think I could do it justice. It's also got a lot of like I don't want to make it sound like they're completely pagan, but there's definitely like a sort of harkening back to like I guess you could say like a paganistic kind of thing, almost like if you're really familiar with the reference, like the Volkish tendencies in Germany, like a late 19th century. And I know we're getting super esoteric. That's why it's so hard to explain it. There's other stuff. There's kind of like your more normal alt right people, like I mentioned Unite the Right, so that's kind of like your average like internet racist or whatever.
hmm
And there's just it's you really do need a graph. It's really hard to explain all these different factions.
So are these all the factions of like the far right or just the right?
This would be like the far right, so under the umbrella term of online right. But
Okay.
now, like I said, like all these these staffers, and I will not give names, sources, or anything like that to protect people. But I mean, a lot of the staffing is being pulled from that sort of milieu
Yeah.
because I mean, nowadays young men are mostly right wing, and then there's the type that are apt to be kind of interested in doing this. They're going to be of a particular sort. So I mean,
Yeah. Well, I mean,
that's
it's interesting you say because it's the same way in the Democratic Party where it's like, and in the left where it's like you'll have like, you'll maybe have center left or purely left wing people who are congressmen or whatever it is, or were in the administration, but all those staffers, especially those mid level staffers, they were way more left
it's kind of
than
yeah. So
like who their that maybe political appointee that appointed them.
it's kind of
And
like you'll
there's
have like
there's influences like Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders, they kind of were pushing
DSA, like
like
the
yeah,
DSA, or
well,
like
yeah, and they were definitely pushing like, hey, like we'll give you support, but you got to hire these people, like that
yeah,
kind of stuff.
it's kind of stuff like that. I mean, it's kind of funny because it's like you'll have like your normie Democrat or your normie like Republican official, and then like their staffers are either like raging like communists behind the scenes, or like their
Yeah,
staffers are sending like racist memes back and forth, and it's like so. I mean, that's kind of where a lot of it's coming from. I mean, and don't get me wrong, there is like normal people, but like I don't know if you saw that where like that Doge staffer got in trouble because he had like an anonymous Twitter account and he was saying like we need to like like expel all the Indians and stuff like that. I mean I'll put it like this: he was not the only one, and
No, I mean,
like
I tell people that all the time. I was kind of having this debate with myself the other day. Is when people are like, I think back to like when you hear these people on like MSNBC just being like, oh, the right, the right, the right, and these are terrible people, and like people are like, oh, they're racist, and it's like, people immediately think they're like this far alt right people, and I'm like, no, like they're all over the place, and there's like normal people, there's not normal people, I'm like, it's a lot more prevalent than you think it is. And I don't want to say that to like add legitimacy, but I say that to like almost validate some of their grievances, where it's like, hey, like, we aren't happy with the economy. We're not happy with its DEI. And like I sit there, I'm like, there's a lot of people that would fall into these categories. Maybe they're not alt right, but they might be like kind of, typical conservative or, more on the left of the MAGA movement, like that kind of stuff.
I think it's kind of like you got your average voter, and then you got the people that are you're basically you're pulling your cadres. I
Yeah.
mean, it's a really kind of put it in like 20th century terms. I mean, you could have like I think the best way you could put it is like you had all these like party states, whether it was like Germany or the Soviet Union or whatever. You'd have the normal population, and then you would have like the cadres from which they would pull from. Like it's
Yeah.
kind of a distinct thing of itself, and it's kind of like that. I mean, but yeah, like that Stafford. I mean, that's kind of what I'm talking about. So like from what I understand, like from I don't want to say I guess mid level would probably be the best way to put it. From like mid level to up is like they're fairly normal Republicans. They may be like super MAGA, but they're not like
Well,
like it's
and
not
then,
like
and they may be like externally MAGA, right? Like
yeah
I've always heard that's kind of the thing with Marjorie Taylor Greene was like she's all MAGA, 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 but then when you kind of get her behind closed doors, she's like, yeah, well, maybe this, maybe that, we might
yeah.
actually
It's
be
kind of like
willing to kind of back down a little bit, but like this is all performative, like all that kind of stuff.
yeah, and that's kind of your normal politician. But like in terms of like their staffers, like that's like the
Yeah,
low level.
that's
That's where you
different.
get like the actual like ideologues and stuff like that. And it's uh, I need to try to like you said like we need a chart, and I'll try to sit down and talk to people I know and see if we can't like
Create something.
obviously with yeah kind of give you an idea of what we're talking about since you're interested in it. But I
Yeah,
mean like there's so many different groups, and kind of one
it's
thing that's really
go
happening
ahead.
right now was excuse me, I keep sneezing. Two, like one thing I don't think people have really thought about too is like the boomers are dying off. So now like a
Yeah,
lot of those boomer organizations, it's really the Zoomers kind of. I don't really feel like the Xers or millennials kind of establish themselves in the same way Xers are. It's very
yeah,
much so it's kind of interesting. So there is kind of that. I mean, that kind of explains the duopoly where you have the mid and high level being kind of within the boundaries of normal Republican, and then, like I said, like the lower levels are like really right wing, kind of like and it's kind of like you said, it's kind of the same on the Democratic side.
yeah.
It's
It's on
just
both sides.
it's generational turnover at this point, basically.
Yeah. One thing I was thinking about is because and I almost think was kind of intentional is when we look at the Democratic side, they definitely were like, hey, like we're and I think everybody kind of knew this. Everyone who kind of gone below surface level understanding of what's actually happening kind of knew, hey, there's disagreement between the Biden administration and Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, AOC. Like that's why they were always supporting until the very end. Like all this other kind of stuff like that was there, and they were going to get some of their staff members, get some picks on the policy, but Biden's going to run it. And there's that kind of compromise and it almost was kind of like all parts of the coalition were represented. I think maybe the part that was kind of out there was maybe like that conservative Democrat side, but I'm like that's still like it wasn't like they didn't have opportunities and they didn't have a chance like to kind of really get in. And there was that compromise. And I think one thing that Biden did well on was he really kind of tried to hold the group together. Like all the stuff he did with the LGBT stuff, like none of that shit actually went through Congress. It was all executive orders, and Trump came in and just got rid of that shit. So what I think though is that when I look at like what Trump's doing, I don't think it's really kind of like okay, like this methodical, like okay, we're having this. I'm bringing in the tech right guys and the alt right guys and the normal Republicans and the the liberal Republicans. I'm not bringing in all these people under one roof. It's very much like it's all kind of scattered all over the place and not fully representative of the Republican Party. Would you say that's probably the same, or would you probably say that's true?
I think in terms of like the ideological scattering, yeah, it's true. It's all over the place, but I think that's just because like it really does feel like a generational divide because it's like I said, like the mid to high level, you've got your millennials up to boomers, mostly boomers and Xers. Like I know, I'm pretty sure Stephen Miller's an Xer, if I'm not mistaken. So that's kind of like a good
I think
example
he's
of.
like in his like 40s or something like that. Like, he's not
Yeah,
that
I think
old.
I want to. Yeah, I want to say he's like 80 or 81, so some kind of edge millennial, edge
Yeah,
X or whatever. So I mean, like in the sense that like yeah, I mean, and like a big thing is like polling is consistently showing like younger Republicans, those on the right, have really different views on a lot of major issues compared to like older
yeah,
Republicans. So like it's like all boomers, like the big thing, like immigration, I think is probably the best example of this. So like if you asked a boomer, and I'm kind of generalizing here, but I mean we're talking in averages, they'll be like, "Yeah, I don't like illegal immigration, but I like legal immigration." Whereas if you ask, Zoomers, especially on the right, they're going to be a completely different story. I mean, like I said, like
yeah.
the mustacher that got in trouble, his whole thing was like, we don't want any immigration, we want to expel people. I mean, and funnily enough, well, that's one thing Stephen Miller got famous for was I think it was during the first Trump administration. He got interviewed, and they're like, "What do you consider the ideal level of immigration?" He was like, "Can I say a negative number?" So I mean, like, there's definitely like, I don't, and like another big one that like since we're talking about it and kind of dancing around it almost like Israel. That's a huge one. Like
Really?
boomers, Xers, and all them, they absolutely love Israel. You look at younger Republicans, completely different story. That's a
But so
huge.
so but does Stephen Miller have a different opinion on Israel than say I know he's Jewish, but than Donald Trump?
I don't know. I really can't call.
Because
I'm not. I would
because
imagine so, or not. So, not.
I always thought Republicans looked at Israel. Yeah, you had some that were super ideological, but it's kind of like the most people. The reason why they look at it was just way more pragmatic. They're like, hey, we don't really like that this is happening. We can't really do anything about it, and we're not going to, abandon probably the best ally we got in the region. And I think that's where they're at. And yeah, I mean, I think younger people are like, I think they still see that. They're like, hey, like this is what we got to do. This is what we got to do. But they're like, hey, maybe we're not going to send weapons or troops over there. And I think that's maybe you'll definitely see that when if Trump tries to send people to Gaza, you'll start seeing I think those younger Republicans being like, yeah, I'm not in on that. But I think you'll see some older ones who'll kind of be like that too. I think everybody's kind of been fucked up since Iraq to where, on certain issues they're like, yeah, like we're definitely going to abandon Israel.
I think so. Like, if you go back to like say Richard Nixon or George H.W. Bush, yeah, there was definitely that pragmatism, and famously, a lot of people forget about this. George H.W. Bush, actually, if I'm not mistaken, back in like 91, 92, actually placed some sanctions on Israelis.
Yeah.
Not, I don't think it was Israel itself, but it was on like certain factions within Israel because they were trying to get them to reel back, building settlements in places. So that was kind of pragmatic. I mean, but then with like the boomers and stuff, especially when they came to power, a lot of it, especially like the Republican Party, was evangelicals. Like evangelicals are like ideologically because of certain tenets of the religion are like super pro-Israel from like a
Hmm.
religious standpoint. And that's kind of motivated a lot. But now you've got the situation where it's like with young people, like I'm seeing it in the polling and I'm seeing it from just like talking to people. Like there's definitely like an anti. I don't know if anti-Israel is the right word for it. I would say it is because there's definitely it's like you said, like if you poll it or stuff like that, like should we supply Israel with weapons, support them, yada yada. It's consistently major numbers of like young Republicans are completely against that. Now, I don't think it's of the same kind of sense of like on the how you got like on the left you got like the BDS movement and stuff like that, but like there
Yeah.
is definitely I think it's like there's definitely a sea change in American political things. I can't remember. I think it was the Atlantic had some polling data just come out. And they're like, when you look at like anti-Semitism in the American like politics, it's not class based. It's not really race based. It's age based. So if you look at it like your boomers and stuff, your Xers, fully love Israel and all that. Then you look at the young people, it's like, oh, okay, there's quite a bit of anti-Semitism, and like I said, like especially if you look at like the staffers, just kind of focusing on that, like they're coming from that age group. So I
Yeah.
mean,
Well, I
and they're,
mean,
I mean,
go ahead.
no, I just kind of just going to double down on that.
Well, I was just gonna say, I mean, I think, when I look at Israel, I'm just kind of like, they're always getting bombed and they're always doing this shit. But I'm like, I think a lot of people are kind of like, like they're not really doing a lot of good either. You know what I mean? Like it's almost kind of like they're wanting this war to drag out on. They're wanting the status quo to just keep shifting and shifting in their favor. They're not willing to come in and work with anybody on certain
Yeah,
things. And
and
then I think for me, I'm like, yeah, I kind of agree with it. But at the same time, like you could say the same fucking thing about the Palestinians, where I'm like, like if you really want peace, stop throwing fucking bombs, and you might be able to, like that's one thing that like I've heard some people, when October 7th or whatever happened, there was a group of people that were like, well, they were like being captive and held against their will and basically in an open air prison, so they should be able to defend themselves. And I'm like, I don't know about that. So I think there's like, I think people kind of I think they just kind of blind themselves in the whole Israeli argument. It's like, and I think a lot of the younger people are just kind of like, hey, we're just kind of over it, and the Israelis aren't trying to do anything good with it, and the Palestinians aren't trying to do anything good with it. It's like no one wants to change the status quo for the better.
I mean, yeah, and like I could get into like the strategic rationale behind a lot of that, but like it's just one of those issues, like, so we don't get bogged down on it. Like, it's just one of those issues that I think is really kind of signaling like how American politics is changing. Because I mean, you know, there's that. I mean, I
Do
really
you think
don't
do you
think.
think the U.S. would ever join an anti-Israeli alliance or like coalition?
Give it 10, 15 years, then yeah, maybe.
Really?
I think once the boomers are mostly died off, and I'm not saying that to be callous. I'm just saying, realistically, based on the polling, you're going to reach a situation where like there's really no big pro-Israel bastion in American politics, and at that point, like just sheer demographic math is going to kind of, and it's like you said, like really we derive no strategic benefit from that
No.
relationship. It may have made
I
sense
think
back during the
recently we have. I think this whole ever since October 7th, I'll criticize Israel all I want, but I'm like, I think they kind of hit the nail on the head with Hezbollah, and the way they handled that kind of led to this whole Syrian war um, ending. And then they've also kind of, I feel like, really put Iran in its place. And I think, say what you want, I think they kind of, I don't want to say they quelled, but they kind of put down a little bit of this stuff in Gaza. And I think strategically, I'd be like, hey, I think they came out better in a better position than they were initially. And so I'm like, yeah, like maybe this long term isn't gonna be great for them, but I'm like, this past war had been pretty good for them as far as the strategic calculus that's being done.
well,
Like, what did they
I'll,
lose? What did they
okay, so
lose?
like if you want to make the case of why this strategically kind of, so like one thing is like, okay, as of today it's looking like they're going to have to go back into Gaza. So I mean that's that whole thing's going to continue on. The
Hmm.
Houthis are saying they're going to join back in, and then there's signs that the ceasefire in Lebanon's about to break down again. So I mean, like you could, which I mean, yeah, I agree. Like Hezbollah and Hamas have been degraded, but like one of the last things Blinken did as Secretary of State was he did that. I don't know if you saw that press conference. He was like, "Yeah, we assess they've recruited as many as they've lost in Gaza."
Yeah.
So I mean, like it's yeah, they've done a lot of damage, but the thing I always go back to, just focusing in on that for a second, we killed, I think it was like 2 million and some Vietnamese during the Vietnam War, and we saw that ended, and we killed, I can't remember how many tens of thousands of Taliban fighters I think we killed in Afghanistan. And again, we saw how that ended. So I mean, it's like it's one thing to do a lot of damage, but like and this is a good friend of mine really made a really good point on this, and it's kind of stuck with me in the last few months. As Americans, we really don't understand Clausewitz. If you're familiar with Clausewitz, he's this really famous Prussian officer from the Napoleonic Wars. He writes his book. It's considered one of the fundamental texts on modern warfare. And like his whole probably the main point he makes is you don't want to look at warfare through the spectrum of warfare in itself. Like, yeah, you can kill a lot of people, you can stack bodies. I mean, like I said, he was an officer in the Napoleonic era, so he got to see Napoleon up close. But at the end, Napoleon lost, and it's this point he made with that is like you could do all these amazing things, but like at the end of the day, war has to have a political objective, and that the political objective has to make sense and be obtainable. It's one it's you can't go set out with like, oh, I'm just going to conquer the world. You got to set with like, okay, say you're the U.S. in World War II. It's like, okay, we've been attacked. Obviously, we want to contain these threats if possible. Take them over and then contain the Soviets for the next round. It's kind of makes reasonably obtainable goals. And yeah, I agree that Israel's have done a lot of damage in their immediate neighborhood, and I agree that's obviously they've inflicted more casualties than they've taken, but one of the big things is before this war, Israel, and one of the big reasons Hamas launched the attack, according to them, the Abraham Accords during Trump's first term. Biden was trying to expand those, and Trump wants to expand those, but it's Israel's actions in Gaza have like so damaged their reputation in the region.
Yeah.
That whole process has collapsed. Now, Saudi Arabia came out just another week ago and reiterated they will never, normalize relations with Israel as long as there's not an independent Palestine. So I mean, that's kind of hurting them in the long run that they're not, securing the rest of the region. But then there's also like bigger things like, the point I've made before in past episodes, and now the Israelis kind of talk about it openly. So yeah, Assad collapsed, but his replacement was HTS, which is a terrorist organization that we still have sanctions on. We refuse to remove those sanctions, by the way, and it's Turkish aligned. And then the Turks and the Israelis have gotten into a pretty heated debate over it because the Israelis don't want Turkey on their border, and obviously Turkey doesn't want to lose their new puppet regime, so that's kind of increased it. So I mean, they've replaced Assad with Turkey in essence. And then, yeah, they did a lot of damage to Iran, but now, I don't know if you've seen this, like Trump's been especially talking about it a lot. Like, yeah, you took out all these Iranian proxies, or at least damaged them, so now the Iranians are, at least if you believe the reports, they're actually more seriously looking at, building nuclear weapons this time. It's kind of, if they no longer have those groups as proxies, they might as well have a permanent deterrent in the form of like a nuclear arsenal. So it's kind of like, you've achieved some stuff, but you've not really fundamentally altered the strategic balance. You still have these. I mean, they're damaged for now, but it's like, we've been here before. Like Hezbollah got pretty banged up in 2006, and then as recently as 2014, Israel launched ground invasions of Gaza. So I mean, it's not like we've not been in this position before. They've ultimately recovered, and it's like it's just not really fundamentally altering their strategic position, and it's
So
coming with
good.
so many other costs. Is kind of my take. Like last year, I think it was as of the last estimate I saw, like Israel's GDP shrunk by like 20%. I mean, that's incredible. Like the port of Elliot, I think is how you pronounce it, in like southern Israel, which is like one of their main ports, had to file for bankruptcy because the Houthis were like blockading them. So I mean, it's like, yeah, you're on the battlefield, you're doing great, but economically, diplomatically, I mean, it's just not really coming out ahead for them, I think. And then that kind of has reverberations on us. If you wanted me to put it from like a specifically American perspective, I'll put it in probably the most basic terms I can. Israel is a nation of, I think, if off the top of my head, about 8 million. I want to say 8 million. That might be off by a little bit, but whatever. Versus, okay, you got Egypt next door, which is probably going to top out this century somewhere around 150 million people. You've got, Syria, you've got Iraq, you've got Turkey, you got Saudi Arabia. At the end of the day, to me, just as from a very basic cost benefits analysis, wouldn't you rather have like hundreds of millions of people to trade with to sell military hardware to versus 8 billion? And then we can get. Go
So
ahead.
I agree with everything you just said, and we got 9 minutes left. So I agree with everything you just said. So I guess where my position is that Israel essentially has consolidated its gains. it needs to end its offensive. I think that like yeah, like I'm 100% into that. Like I think Israel's done what it needs to do. But I think where they are at now is they kind of are getting to the peak, if not they've already hit the peak of what they're going to get out of this. And I definitely do agree that yeah, like if they keep going on and on and on, like yeah, I saw that thing with Blinken, and it's like yeah, they're just gonna keep being in this issue. So I think for them, or I'd say, hey, consolidate your gains, write the piece, and get moving. Because it's only going to get worse for you now, and you've got land in Syria that is supposed to help you. You've changed the stuff in Lebanon, and you've done these other kind of things. Consolidate now and try to, position yourself long term. Now, I don't think they're doing that. And I think that's why they're trying to get the US involved to back them up because they know it's only going to go downhill from here. So I definitely agree with you on that. But to bring it back into the factions question, when the dust settles with Israel and with what's going on in the Middle East, do you see there being a predominantly Israeli party? And what party do you think that would be? The Democrats or the Republicans?
I, that's a tough one because
They're gonna go somewhere, right? But it's like, where do
that
you go?
I just don't know if they can because I mean, for one, demographically there are declining like just as a percentage of the U.S. population. So like I mean, just the sheer number of votes they can bring to the table is decreasing. But it's also like we've talked about demographics on the show before, and like the Jewish community here in America is like a very big example of that because like your average secular Jew or like your non-Orthodox Jew, they're having at most like one or like you know I think their TFR last statistics I saw was like 1.1, 1.2. In cities like New York, it's even lower. It's like South Korea tier. And then,
Hmm.
so I mean, it's like that's happening. So like that part of the Jewish community is kind of demographically fading away. And then the community that's really having a lot of kids is the Orthodox Jews. And I mean, they're very like pro-Trump. They're very like all this. So I mean, like in theory, they could go in the Republicans, but like I said, I mean, younger Republicans aren't exactly big friends of Israel either. So I mean, it's one of those things where it's just like I don't know, and like yeah, they may have to go somewhere, but I don't know if that's still going to translate into like the parties, either party for that matter, being like, oh yeah, well, be the pro-Israel party. I mean, it would not be impossible for there to be none. I mean, a pretty good example of this would be like from recent times, like apartheid South Africa. And I'm not trying to get in that whole debate, but I'm just making that as kind of like an example of like where you're like it's so politically toxic that you can't get like neither party can really own that issue. Like back in the 80s, Ronald Reagan was trying to prevent sanctions on South Africa because they were fighting the Soviets and Angola and stuff, and it's still even he couldn't get the Republicans to rally around that. So I mean, it's not impossible that there could be in either situation.
Hmm.
So I mean,
Okay.
that's just my 2 cents, and I just think demographically, like I said, like once the boomers are gone, there's just no real demographic to rally around.
Yeah. Well, and I've always said, I think the issue that I have is not with Israel itself, but I think it's with the Israeli leadership that they've had for the past 20 something years. You know,
We'll
I
see.
I I think that's really kind of hurt them.
Well, see, that's a big reason they're kind of in this situation. Like you said, you can't like they're not wanting to consolidate. It's because of the internal politics. Like
Yeah.
we're
Well,
talking
and
about
and
our
you're talking about the fertility rate. It's almost like the exact same in Israel too. The super conservative
oh yeah,
people are the ones who are having all the kids. And, I think it's like they're even militarily exempt from the draft. Like they've
the
got all
ultra
these special
orthodox. Yeah.
privileges, and then you got this other group over here that's kind of the exact opposite. So it's kind of like they're having the same issue that we're having in the United States.
Well, speaking of that, real fast, because I think that's fascinating. So, like you said, the ultra orthodox in Israel, they're trying to change it, but they're just meeting so much resistance that it's not working so far. So, like the Orthodox are on track, I think, to be like 60 to 70% of the population by
Yeah.
like the second half of this century. And it's like a lot of people have said, like if you can't get that portion of the population to serve in the military, and it's also because they're religious customs, they don't want to, like, a lot of the men refuse to, work because they studied the Torah and at the yeshivas and stuff like that. How is that economically and militarily going to work? I
Yeah.
mean, they live in a. I mean, the Arabs aren't going away. If you can't get the majority of your population just refusing to serve on religious grounds, I mean, where does that leave you?
Yeah.
But specific to this current situation, a lot of the reason they can't consolidate and move on is, Netanyahu's cabinet. It's composed of a lot of different factions, and there is the far right factions. Like, I don't know if you saw this today, but like, I think his name's Smotrich.
Yep.
I'm probably butchering that pronunciation, but anyway, he's pushing like Bibi and them. He wants to annex the entire West Bank. Like, I mean, he's been publicly talking about it since like last year and stuff. So I mean, it's it's kind of the factionalism we're talking about, but on like a grander scale, probably with more
Yeah.
strategic implications. But I mean, that's there, and I mean that's another. I mean, like I said, in 15 years when the boomers are gone, and then you got guys like that are the main politicians over there. Where do you think that's? I mean, I just can't see it being a sustainable relationship in the modern day. Those kind of grounds. I mean, you're going to get in a situation where like nobody really wants to sell weapons or like military support them, and they're pushing to like annex like their neighbors and stuff. I can't see it.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's end it there. All
All
right.
right, see you. Man.
See-